Victoria's entire morning had been a disaster, but nothing compared to the moment she turned too quickly and sent a full cup of steaming coffee straight onto the chest of the impeccably dressed man standing behind her. "Oh my God," she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. The dark liquid spread across the expensive fabric of his tailored white shirt, soaking into the pristine material like ink on paper. The cafe fell silent. The man exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he looked down at the damage. His dark blue eyes lifted to meet hers, and Victoria braced herself for the inevitable outburst. She had just ruined what was probably $1,000 shirt, and judging by the expensive watch on his wrist and the sleek black car parked outside, he wasn't the kind of man who took these things lightly. I am so sorry," she stammered, grabbing a handful of napkins from the counter and attempting to blot at the stain. "I wasn't looking where I was going, and the man's hand gently caught her wrist, stopping her frantic movements. "It's fine," he said, his voice deep and controlled. Victoria finally took a proper look at him. He was tall, ridiculously handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a presence that commanded attention. His dark hair was neatly styled, his suit tailored to perfection except now, of course, for the giant coffee stain she had placed right over his chest. "No, it's not fine," she insisted, feeling her stomach twist with guilt. "Let me pay for the dry cleaning," or he tilted his head, studying her. "What's your name?" she blinked. "Victoria." "Victoria," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. Then, to her surprise, a small smile played at the corner of his lips. "All right, Victoria, since you feel so bad about it, how about this, you let me take you to dinner to make up for it?" She stared at him. "Wait." "What? Dinner?" he said smoothly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "You spilled coffee on me." "I think an apology dinner is in order." She laughed nervously, certain she had misheard him. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Victoria couldn't tell if this was some kind of joke. "I'm offering to pay for your dry cleaning, not—" "I don't need dry cleaning," he interrupted, "but I do need dinner, and I'd rather have it with you." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. This had to be the most absurd situation she had ever found herself in. Who was this man? As if reading her mind, he extended his hand. Philip Lancaster. Her breath caught slightly. Philip Lancaster. The name sounded familiar, too familiar, and then it hit her. He was the millionaire CEO of Lancaster Enterprises, one of the most powerful business moguls in the city. She had just spilled coffee on a man who could probably buy the entire cafe if he wanted to. "Oh," she breathed. His lips twitched in amusement. "Ah. You recognize me now?" Victoria felt her cheeks heat. Yeah, I mean, I've heard your name before." "So, how about it?" Philip asked, his gaze never leaving hers. "Dinner?" Everything in her screamed that this was insane. She was a struggling freelance writer who could barely afford rent, and he was him. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something confident yet oddly genuine that made her pulse quicken. "Okay," she heard herself say before she could second-guess it. "Good." Philip pulled a sleek black business card from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "Be ready at 7. "I'll pick you up." And just like that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Victoria standing there, heart racing, wondering what on earth she had just agreed to. Victoria spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying the bizarre encounter over and over. By the time she got home, she was certain she had imagined the whole thing. There was no way Philip Lancaster, a man whose face had graced magazine covers and business journals, had actually invited her to dinner. Yet, the black business card in her hand was very real. She turned it over between her fingers, half expecting the ink to vanish like some elaborate prank. The weight of it, the sleek embossed lettering, all screamed luxury. It wasn't just a card, it was a statement. Her tiny apartment was a stark contrast to the world he lived in. The chipped furniture, the second-hand bookshelf overflowing with worn novels. The flickering kitchen light she still hadn't gotten around to fixing, none of it belonged in the same universe as Philip Lancaster's. And yet, he was picking her up at 7. Victoria stood in front of her closet, biting her lip. She had no idea where he was taking her, which made choosing an outfit nearly impossible. She cycled through options, discarding dress after dress until she settled on a sleek black number she had bought on a whim last year but never had an occasion to wear. It was simple, elegant, and most importantly made her feel like she belonged. By the time the clock struck 7, her nerves were a tangled mess. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. She took a steadying breath and opened it. Philip stood there, effortlessly composed, dressed in a crisp navy suit. The coffee stain from earlier was long gone, replaced with a new shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His gaze swept over her, lingering for a fraction of a second before he gave a satisfied nod. "You look beautiful," he said, his tone smooth, certain. She swallowed, caught off guard by the directness. "Thank you. You clean up well, too." A flicker of amusement crossed his face before he extended his arm. "Shall we?" When they stepped outside, she barely had time to register the sleek black car waiting at the curb before a driver in a sharp uniform opened the door for her. She hesitated. "You have a driver," Philip arched a brow. "Would you rather I drove myself?" She slid into the plush leather seat, trying not to react to how absurdly luxurious it felt. The doors closed with a quiet precision, sealing her inside a world that smelled of expensive cologne and something distinctly him. As the car pulled away, she forced herself to breathe. "So where are we going?" "You'll see." His answer did nothing to calm her nerves. Minutes later, the car pulled up in front of a restaurant that looked like something straight out of a movie. The entrance was lined with glowing lanterns, a valet in a pressed suit waiting at the curb. The name of the restaurant was one she recognized, exclusive, nearly impossible to get into without connections. He stepped out first, offering his hand. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was warm, steady. Inside, the restaurant was even more breathtaking. The lighting was low, the atmosphere intimate, the scent of fresh herbs and truffle oil lingering in the air. A maitre d' appeared instantly, greeting Philip with the kind of deference reserved for royalty. They were led to a private table near a grand window overlooking the city skyline. Victoria eased into the chair, still trying to process the sheer extravagance of it all. "I have to ask, do you do this often?" Philip leaned back slightly, studying her. "Do what?" "Take women to ridiculously expensive restaurants as an apology for spilling coffee on you." His lips curved slightly. "No, this is a first." She narrowed her eyes. "Really?" He nodded. "I don't usually have coffee spilled on me, and I rarely ask someone to dinner because of it." She tilted her head, curiosity getting the better of her. "Then why me?" Something flickered in his gaze, something unreadable. "Because you were different. You didn't fawn, you didn't scramble to impress me, you were just you." She didn't know how to respond to that. The waiter arrived, presenting an elaborate menu with dishes she could barely pronounce. Philip ordered without hesitation, selecting a bottle of wine that had to cost more than her grocery bill for the month. As the evening unfolded, conversation flowed effortlessly. He was sharp, quick-witted, and surprisingly easy to talk to. He asked about her writing, genuinely interested in her answers. She found herself relaxing, laughing even. But beneath it all, there was a lingering question she couldn't ignore. When dessert arrived, an intricate masterpiece of dark chocolate and gold leaf, she finally voiced it. "All right, Philip. You've been charming, mysterious, and completely unexpected, but I still don't get it." He set his fork down, intrigued. "Get what? Why a man like you, a millionaire, a CEO, someone who probably has models throwing themselves at him, chose to have dinner with me?" He held her gaze, unflinching. Because I wanted to. Her heart stumbled. Philip leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. Victoria, I spend my days surrounded by people who only care about what I can offer them. You didn't ask for anything, you didn't try to impress me, you were just real. I don't get that often, she swallowed. And what exactly are you looking for? His expression was unreadable. Maybe I'll know when I find it. The air between them shifted, something unspoken settling in the space. For the first time that night, Victoria wasn't sure if she was out of her depth or exactly where she was meant to be. As the evening continued, Victoria found herself caught between fascination and disbelief. Every moment with Philip felt like stepping into a different world, one where the rules were rewritten, where a single dinner could shift the course of her carefully structured life. The rich scent of espresso lingered in the air as the final remnants of their dessert sat between them, the delicate gold leaf catching the candlelight. Philip studied her with an intensity that made her spine tingle. His presence was overwhelming, not because he was flashy or overbearing, but because he was entirely focused on her. It was unnerving to be the sole object of someone's attention, especially when that someone was a man who could command an entire boardroom with a single glance. Outside the grand restaurant, the city pulsed with life, neon lights flickering in the distance. When they stepped outside, a sudden gust of wind sent a shiver through Victoria. Before she could react, Philip shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders with an ease that suggested he did things like this without thinking. The fabric was warm, carrying the faintest trace of his cologne. She should have handed it back immediately, but instead she clutched it closer. "Where to next?" he asked, his voice low, expectant. She blinked up at him. "There's a next." His lips quirked slightly. "I'm not ready for the night to end." "Are you?" A part of her screamed that she should go home, that stepping any further into Philip Lancaster's world would only make it harder to leave. But there was another part, one she usually ignored, that whispered, "Why not?" "I suppose I can be convinced," she said, surprising herself. His expression shifted into something unreadable before he gestured toward the waiting car. This time, when she slid into the plush leather seat, she wasn't as overwhelmed. The city blurred past as they drove, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Minutes later, they pulled up in front of a sleek glass building. The doorman nodded at Philip in recognition, pushing open the doors without hesitation. Victoria stepped inside and immediately felt like she had walked into another world. The lobby was all marble and open space, the kind of place where whispers carried and every detail was designed to impress. Philip led her to a private elevator, pressing a single button without looking. The doors slid shut, and the space between them suddenly felt much smaller. She turned to him, her pulse unsteady. "Is this your place?" He met her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "I wanted to show you something." The elevator doors opened to reveal a penthouse that overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance. The space itself was impossibly refined modern furniture, dark wood accents, and a faint scent of something rich and expensive in the air. Victoria stepped forward instinctively, drawn to the view. "This is..." She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. Philip stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "Whenever I need to clear my head, I stand here." She turned to face him, the weight of his words settling between them. "You needed to clear your head tonight?" A slow exhale left him. "I needed something different." His gaze held hers steady. "I needed you." The air between them shifted, something unspoken crackling in the silence. Victoria's heart pounded. She had spent the entire evening trying to understand why Philip had chosen her. Why, out of all the people he could have spent his time with, he had decided to sit across from her at dinner and bring her here. But now, standing in his world, she realized the answer had been in front of her the whole time. He wasn't just looking for company, he was looking for something real, and so was she. But reality had a way of creeping back in, and as much as she wanted to lose herself in this moment, she knew the night had to end. She took a step back, adjusting the jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. "Philip, tonight has been incredible. But I should probably go." Something flickered in his expression, something close to disappointment, but he nodded. "I'll have the car take you home." She hesitated. "Thank you." He walked her to the elevator, his presence a steady force beside her. As the doors opened, she turned, searching for words that wouldn't sound ridiculous. But before she could say anything, Philip reached out, his fingers brushing her hand. "This doesn't have to be the last time we see each other." Her breath caught. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to throw caution aside and see where this led. But that voice in the back of her head whispered warnings, reminders of the differences between them, the precarious balance of stepping too far into a world that wasn't hers. Instead of answering, she stepped into the elevator, watching as the doors slowly slid shut between them. As the car carried her away from the glittering skyline, Victoria realized she had made a mistake. Because no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she already knew. This wasn't the end, not even close. The city lights blurred past as Victoria leaned back against the leather seat of the car, her thoughts tangled in a way they had never been before. She had left Philip standing in his penthouse, walked away from the magnetic pull of something she didn't quite understand yet. But even as the car carried her away from his world, she felt the weight of his presence lingering, refusing to fade. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the way he had looked at her, steady, certain. She had spent years convincing herself that men like Philip Lancaster didn't exist outside of stories, that the type of attention he had given her wasn't real. And yet, it had been. The next morning, Victoria was convinced she wouldn't hear from him again. Men like him didn't chase. They didn't wait. They moved forward, leaving nights like the one they had shared in the past. So when her phone rang just after noon and Philip's name flashed on the screen, her breath caught. She hesitated for only a second before answering. His voice was smooth, familiar now. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she exhaled, gripping the edge of her desk. "That depends. Are you calling to tell me I still owe you for dry cleaning?" A quiet laugh. "No. I'm calling to tell you I have reservations for dinner tonight and I'd rather not attend alone." She didn't answer right away. She should have seen this coming, but still, it caught her off guard. He waited, patient. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she finally said, her voice softer than she intended. "Because," she hesitated, searching for a reason that made sense. "Because we're from two completely different worlds, Philip, and I don't think I belong in yours." There was a pause on the other end. "That's not for you to decide." Her heart stumbled. He continued, his tone quieter now. "You walked away last night, Victoria. I let you, but I'm not going to pretend that I didn't want you to stay." She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. "Philip." "Don't overthink it," he said simply. "Just say yes." And against every logical part of her mind, she did. When the car pulled up outside her apartment that evening, she felt the same nervous energy as before. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't walking into the unknown. Philip didn't take her to another restaurant. Instead, the car wove through the city until they reached a place she didn't expect, a quiet rooftop garden, strung with delicate lights, with only one table set beneath the sky. She turned to him, surprised. "This is better," he finished for her. She nodded, unable to disagree. He pulled out her chair, waiting until she was seated before taking his own. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, the city hummed distant below them. For the first time, it felt like they were somewhere neither of them had to belong to, it was just them. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me something real," she frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, tell me something about you that no one else knows. Something that isn't rehearsed or expected. She hesitated, then glanced up at the sky. When I was little, I used to climb onto the roof of my house to look at the stars. My mom thought I was asleep, but I'd sneak out just to sit there for hours. It was the only place I ever felt completely free. Philip was silent for a moment, and now, she met his gaze. Now I don't find places like that as often. His expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes. Maybe you're looking in the wrong places, she exhaled, shaking her head. And what about you? What's something real? He didn't look away. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear. I can't remember the last time I met someone who didn't. The weight of his words settled between them. Victoria swallowed. Philip. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. I don't need someone who fits into my world, Victoria. I need someone who makes me want to step out of it. Her pulse pounded. I don't know if I can be that person, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her the smallest, most devastating smile. You already are. And in that moment, she realized something. She could spend forever convincing herself she didn't belong in his world, or she could accept the truth that Philip Lancaster had never cared about that. He had only ever cared about her. And as he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing the softest kiss to her skin, she knew. She wasn't walking away this time. The weeks that followed were nothing short of a whirlwind. Victoria had expected their dinner to be a fleeting moment, an experience she would tuck away as a surreal memory. But Philip refused to fade into the background of her life. He called, he showed up, and he made it impossible for her to dismiss what was happening between them. What started as a spontaneous dinner turned into late-night conversations, stolen moments in the city, and a growing sense of something she couldn't quite name. He never rushed her, never pushed, but there was no denying that Philip Lancaster was a man who knew what he wanted. And for reasons she still couldn't fully comprehend, what he wanted was her. One evening, after a particularly long day of writing, she found herself outside of his office building. The glass tower loomed above her, its polished surface reflecting the city lights. She hadn't planned on coming, but after his cryptic invitation earlier that day, curiosity had won out. When she stepped inside, she was immediately greeted by a receptionist who barely glanced up before pressing a button. Within moments, an elevator arrived, its doors opening as if it had been expecting her. As she stepped inside, she felt the hush of the space around her, the quiet power that came with being in Philip's world. When the doors slid open on the top floor, she found herself in a sleek, expansive office lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. Philip stood near his desk, his jacket draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up as he studied a set of documents. When he looked up and saw her, something in his expression softened. "You came," he said, setting the papers aside. "You make it very hard to say no," she admitted. He gestured toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond it. "Come here." She hesitated before moving forward, standing beside him as she looked out at the glittering skyline. "This is where you spend most of your time?" she asked. A wry look crossed his face. "Too much of it." She glanced at him, really taking him in. The composed, confident man who had swept her into his world was still there, but now she could see something else: the weight of responsibility, the constant demand for perfection. She turned to face him fully. "And what happens when you leave this place?" "I find ways to remind myself why I do it." His gaze held hers. "Lately, that's been you." Her breath caught. Philip reached into a drawer, pulling out a small, elegantly wrapped box. He held it out to her without explanation. She hesitated. "What is this?" "Open it." Her fingers brushed the ribbon before pulling it loose. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, simple, understated, yet undeniably beautiful. She swallowed. "Philip." "It's not about the gift," he said quietly. "It's about what it means." She traced the smooth surface of the bracelet, something warm settling in her chest. "And what does it mean?" "That I want you to know you matter, that this isn't temporary for me," her heart pounded. She had spent so much time convincing herself that this couldn't be real, that men like him didn't pursue women like her for anything beyond a fleeting distraction. But Philip had never treated her like a passing moment. He had made her a part of his life without hesitation, without reservation. She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You scare me," his brows pulled together slightly. "Why?" "Because I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to fit into your world without losing myself." Philip reached for her hand, his grip firm, unwavering. "Then don't fit in," she exhaled shakily. "Victoria," he said, his voice softer now, "I never wanted someone who could blend into my life. I wanted someone who would make me see it differently." Something in her cracked open at his words. For the first time since the night she spilled coffee on him, she let herself believe that this could be real. That maybe, just maybe, she wasn't an outsider in his world, she was something new entirely. She looked down at the bracelet in her hands before slipping it onto her wrist. When she looked up, Philip was watching her, his expression unreadable. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Okay," he tilted his head slightly. "Okay," she gave a small, sure nod. "I'm not walking away." Something flickered in his gaze, something that looked dangerously close to relief. "Good," he said, his voice lower now. "Because I wasn't letting you." And as he pulled her into his arms, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to her forehead, she knew this was only the beginning. Philip had a way of dismantling every carefully built hesitation she had. Victoria had expected to feel overwhelmed by the weight of his world, but instead she found herself drawn deeper, piece by piece, moment by moment. And the more time she spent with him, the more she realized that despite his wealth, despite the power he wielded so effortlessly, he was still just a man who had spent too long surrounded by people who never saw him for who he truly was. She saw him. Days turned into weeks, and their nights were filled with stolen conversations, whispered confessions, and laughter that came easier than it should have. He took her to places she never would have dared to step into on her own private art galleries before they opened to the public, exclusive events where the richest and most powerful people in the city gathered as if they were a breed of their own. But no matter where they went, Philip made it clear, her presence mattered. She was never just an accessory to his life, she was becoming part of it. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park just outside the city, Victoria glanced over at him, taking in the way he seemed lighter, more at ease than the man she had first met. The crisp autumn air wrapped around them, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. He turned his head slightly. "Regret what?" "This," she gestured vaguely between them. "Letting someone like me into your life, it can't have been easy." Philip's pace slowed, his expression thoughtful. "You think I would regret you?" She hesitated. "I think it would have been easier if you had never met me," he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Easier maybe, but better." "No," she looked up at him, searching for any trace of doubt in his face, but there was none. "You've changed things, Victoria," he admitted. "I've spent years living in a world that functions on control, where every interaction is calculated. And then you came along, spilling coffee on me, completely unbothered by who I was, and suddenly nothing made sense the way it used to." A small laugh escaped her. "That's a very poetic way of describing a coffee stain." Philip stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I'm serious," she swallowed, the intensity of his gaze making it impossible to look away. "I don't regret this," he said firmly. "Not for a second." And just like that, the last of her doubts crumbled. But not everyone saw things the way Philip did. The first time she overheard the whispers, she brushed them off. The second time, she couldn't ignore them. It was at a gala, one of those impossibly elegant events where everything gleamed under crystal chandeliers and the air buzzed with quiet judgment. Philip had stepped away to speak with a business associate, leaving her momentarily alone. She had been admiring a sculpture when two women nearby spoke just low enough to be heard. "She doesn't belong here. She's nothing like the women he usually dates. I give it a few more weeks before he gets bored." Victoria's fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass, her pulse rising. She had known, of course, that people would talk. She had known that stepping into Philip's world would come with scrutiny. But hearing it spoken aloud, so casually as if her presence was nothing more than a temporary amusement, made something sharp twist inside her. Philip returned moments later, immediately noticing the shift in her expression. "What's wrong?" She forced a smile. "Nothing." His eyes narrowed slightly, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press. The evening wore on, but the words clung to her, an unwelcome presence in the back of her mind. Later that night, as they drove back to his penthouse, she stared out the window, lost in thought. "You're quiet," Philip said, his voice breaking the silence. She hesitated before finally speaking. "Do you ever think about it?" "Think about what?" "The fact that I don't fit into this world." Philip didn't answer immediately, but when he did, his voice was steady. "Who decides that?" She turned to him. "You know what I mean." His jaw tightened slightly, his fingers tapping against his knee. "If you're asking whether I care about what people think, the answer is no. If you're asking whether I think you don't belong, then you already know my answer." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Philip, this isn't just about you. People talk." "Let them." She shook her head. "That's easy for you to say. You've lived in this world your whole life." "I haven't." Philip was quiet for a moment before he reached over, gently tilting her chin so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Victoria," he said softly, "I don't want someone who fits into my world. I want someone who makes it better, and that's you." Her breath hitched. "You asked me once if I regretted this," he continued. "The only thing I would regret is letting you go." Something inside her cracked open, and suddenly it didn't matter what anyone else thought. This was real, and she wasn't going anywhere. Months later, Victoria stood at the edge of a balcony overlooking the city, the same balcony where Philip had first brought her, where she had first realized how dangerous it was to fall for him. She wasn't afraid anymore. Philip stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as he pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she smiled, leaning back into him. "How ridiculous it is that I ever thought this wouldn't work." He chuckled, his breath warm against her skin. "Took you long enough." She turned in his arms, looping her hands behind his neck. "Are you always this smug when you're right?" "Always," he murmured, brushing his lips against hers. She melted into the kiss, into the certainty of him of them. When they finally pulled apart, Philip reached into his pocket, pulling out something small. Her breath caught as he opened his palm, revealing a ring, a delicate, stunning piece that caught the light just right. Her heart pounded. "I wanted to wait until the perfect moment," he said, his voice steady, sure. "But then I realized every moment with you is perfect." Tears pricked her eyes. "Victoria," Philip continued, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, "you changed everything for me. And I don't want to spend another second of my life without you." She exhaled shakily, overwhelmed, but there wasn't a single ounce of doubt in her heart. "Yes," she whispered. Philip slid the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, holding her as if he never intended to let go. And he never did.